All right, so today we're going to go over the Chapter 23 Great Depression. So we'll start with the causes of the Great Depression, then we'll look at some immediate short-term effects, we'll look at impacts on minorities, and then different groups of Americans, American families, as well as the response that Herbert Hoover has to the Great Depression, and then how that leads to the election of FDR in 1932. So here we go. All right, so when we're looking at the stock market crash that takes place on October 29th, 1929, we have to look at the market in the years leading up to the actual crash. And in those years leading up, and especially months leading up to the crash, we see what's called a bull market, where the prices are consistently rising and are really at like an all-time high. And, you know, when the market is doing so well, people tend to buy and sell vigorously, but also people are buying using speculation. And speculation is guessing. And, you know, guessing can be very dangerous because we don't know. It's impossible to predict what the market's going to be doing. So, you know, buying, watching the stocks increase and decrease, buying while the prices are really high, selling while they're high. Things can get really dangerous with this. More dangerous than speculation, though, is buying on margin. And buying on margin is super important because this is something that is going to be problematic when the market begins to decline, because we're going to see people not being able to pay back what they owe because they only had to pay for a stock 10% up front. So if a stock's $100 and they only have to pay $10 up front, they're much more willing to buy more stock, but buying stock on credit. So when the market begins to decline, people are going to start calling in that money owed, and they're not going to be able to come up with the money, which is what's going to make the market decline so quickly and so fast. So when prices begin to fall, we see a deflation in prices. Investors could no longer pay their margin, and you know that's going to lead to the crash. So we do see two attempts of like large capital investments in the market to try to stimulate it, but they just don't do enough. And on October 29th, it's like really, really rich, large business owners like Carnegie, Rockefeller, those types of people are the ones who are investing these large sums of money to try to save the market. But like I said, they just don't do enough. So on October 29th, 1929, what's known as Black Tuesday, is the official crash of the stock market. And almost immediately, we're going to see a ripple effect. But we have to look at, you know, what caused us to get here, what actions, both domestically and foreign actions, caused us to get to this spot. So first we'll look at the domestic causes, things that were happening here in the United States throughout the 1920s, that are going to lead to negative fluctuations in the market. So we're starting off talking about lack of diversification. And when we talk about lack of diversification, I usually think of it as we kind of put all of our eggs in one basket, and when the basket falls, all the eggs are going to break. So, you know, we had a very limited number of industries. We have the automobile industry and transportation, as well as construction, which were our dominating industries. But almost every other industry is tied directly into those. So since those two markets were up and down, when they take downward turns, there really wasn't anything like other supplemental markets that were going to be able to pick up the slack. So kind of like when it rains, it pours type of thing in the way of market diversification and industry diversification. Moving on, the unequal distribution of wealth. This is an ongoing problem, obviously, something that was a problem prior to the Great Depression, as well as after and into modern day. So we had a very small number of people that owned a majority of the nation's wealth. And when we look at economic stimulation, what we need is consumer spending. We need consumer spending to stimulate the economic cycle. And if we don't have people spending money, then the economic cycle is going to slow down. So when you have a majority of Americans that are living at or below the poverty line, they're not buying goods. And this is going to stall and slow and eventually stop the economic cycle. And that top 1, 2, 3% that owns a majority of the nation's wealth is just simply not going to do enough spending to, pick up for, what the majority of Americans aren't spending at the time. And then I think most importantly, from the 1920s, one of the biggest things we did is that we didn't put limits on credit. There was an overabundance of credit, starting with farming, all the way back to World War I, when the demand for farm goods was extremely high because we're feeding our farmers, to after the war, when the demand for American farm goods remains high as European countries were depending on us, and then all of a sudden the demand for goods goes down and the price of farm goods goes down. We're going to see farmers who had taken out all sorts of loans for seeds and machinery are going to take a huge hit, and it's going to lead to many agricultural bank failures, which is where the Depression kind of starts. And then we also see the banks were investing in the stock market, and your money wasn't protected in banks. So if you invested your money into a bank, the bank could then turn around and put your money into the stock market without any sort of insurance or protection, which created a major loss when the crash occurred. Many people, it said your money was safer under your mattress than it was in a bank. The foreign causes, a couple things are going on with international trade as well as demand from abroad. So we're going to see a fairly sharp decline in exports. Demand for American goods begins to decrease for a number of different reasons. First of all, we have really high tariffs and people just simply can't afford our goods, especially those European countries that are just truly in shambles after World War I. I think of Germany, who was in horrible, horrible economic times. There was no way that they could afford American goods given the economic situation they were put in after the war. We also will see some European countries do quite the opposite, where they're starting to get back on their feet and they just simply don't need American goods anymore. So we have a declining amount of exports, but we also get involved in what's called a circular loan plan that was known as the Dawes Plan. And this took place from 1924 to 1930. And basically what we were trying to do was get our money back that we had loaned to the Allied powers, France and Britain, during World War I. And our plan was, okay, so since Germany owes France and Britain money from reparations of the Treaty of Versailles, we're going to pay Germany money. Germany then can start paying off their reparations, and then France and Britain can then stimulate their own economy and pay us back the money they owe. Well, this is all well and good, and it's really good in theory, but in real life, this is not going to be executed well, because what we are going to see happen is that the money's never going to make it back to the United States. The money gets lost, whether it's between Germany and the Allies or the Allies and the United States. The money is falling into the black hole, if you will, of nothingness. So we don't ultimately get money back, and the whole plan of international trade stimulating our economy is a fail. Okay, so our immediate effects, short-term effects that happen within the first 3 years of the crash is that banks are going to close. Banks are going to close because they truly are just, all of their deposits are exhausted in the stock market. And when the market crashes, people are banks are losing their money either because they had invested it in the market, or people are taking their money out of the banks to protect it. And when all of this happens, we're going to see that the country's going to decrease the money supply. And when we decrease the money supply, we'll see a decrease in purchasing power and a deflation of prices. When prices go down, companies aren't making enough money to pay back their debts, and then they're going to have to start cutting prices, then cutting production. And with the cutting of production, we'll see the cutting of employees. Then people don't have money in their pockets. In the meantime, the Federal Reserve, which kind of served as our national bank at the time, the Federal Reserve System, meaning the national government, is going to increase interest rates, which just seems so silly when people are in economic despair to turn around and say, oh, you know what, we're going to protect the federal government and we're going to increase interest rates to make sure that we're doing okay here in this at the federal level. So in order to fall into a technical economic depression, we have to see certain numbers hit. So in this case, the gross national product decreases by 25%. Capital investments, or money that people are investing into companies in the stock market, are going to go down by $15 billion. Gross farm income decreased by $7 billion, so that's the decrease in the demand for farm goods. And CPI decreases by 25%, so deflation of prices is going to go down 25%, which will hurt the economic cycle as well. So when we think about the Great Depression and the immediate impacts on people, we have to understand that people almost immediately turn to the government for assistance, or the key word here is relief. Unemployment, specifically in Ohio, we could see cities like Toledo up to almost 80% of people unemployed. And we're starting to see people take really, really hard hits, like on their morale. The American belief, the failure to hold a job, was a failure as a man. So men were walking the streets for jobs that didn't exist. Their families were in despair. Families relied on local and public relief systems, like the Red Cross and the Salvation Army. But tax revenues were declining as people didn't have incomes, and state and local governments couldn't provide the relief that people needed. They couldn't keep up with the demand. We do see some organizations do things like soup kitchens and bread lines and try to provide as much as they can, but the numbers were just too large that they couldn't keep up. Many men become nomads, and that means moving around. They're moving around to find money, find jobs, find work, leaving their families behind, and that was called riding the rails. This slide here is hobo language. So as people became nomads and were moving around and were living on the streets, we do start to see them communicate with one another using language and symbols as to not give away what they, like for example, a person is here with a gun, that's one you want to know, but maybe don't want to write it in words. So they gave like hints and clues with this hobo language. As if matters weren't already bad enough in the Great Depression, we're also going to see a huge natural disaster take place in the Great Plains. 1/3 of American farmers had lost their land by 1933, so to add fuel to an already blazing fire, we're going to see what's called the Dust Bowl. This took place from Texas all the way up to North Dakota, so the entire Great Plains. A couple of factors lead to the Dust Bowl. First, we have a very large drought. An increase in heat and a decline in rainfall is going to basically create dust out of all of the dirt that typically had been saturated. Almost all fertile soil in the region had turned to a desert-like cracked dirt. We're also going to see a huge influx of grasshoppers that are swarming the region, destroying any crops that actually could still grow. These black blizzards of dust were going to kill crops and livestock and even sometimes people. But it was a dire situation for those who were living in the Great Plains. Some farms did continue to exist, but the demand for food was so low that they were wasting money producing. So when the Dust Bowl is taking place, a lot of families obviously turn to the idea that they need to escape, they need to get away. And those are going to be called Okies. So families are going to move from Oklahoma to California to escape the work. Families were leaving their farms and traveling to cities further west, mostly like California, cities in California. This became a very common theme to be moving, to be on the move. People had to move around to seek refuge, to seek jobs, whatever it might be. 2.5 million people leave the plains in the largest migration in U.S. history during the Dust Bowl. We'll also see people with truly having horrible health effects from this: malnutrition, starving, homelessness. People were living in shanty towns, which is basically just scraps of materials to create homes. They called them Hoovervilles, as they blamed the Depression on Hoover. But yeah, it was a really bad situation. Here's some images from the Depression we've got up here. This is the Dust Bowl. This is a famous photo, The Migrant Mother by Dorothea Lange. Here's a sharecropper, or a cropper with the, horrible grasshoppers. This is a group of migrant workers, and then this is a shanty. This is what a shanty looked like. So you can see just scraps just thrown together to try to create a home. Okay, so when we look at the effects of the Great Depression on African Americans, specifically, we're going to see an even horrible, as if the Depression wasn't horrible enough for all Americans, it was worse for other certain groups. Prices for cotton and tobacco decreased, so the need for sharecropping was almost just gone. And that left African Americans in the South with virtually no income. Many African Americans then migrated. They moved to cities, but unemployed whites obviously would take the priority for the jobs. Whites would even take jobs previously held by blacks because they were so desperate for employment that they would, in their minds, take these menial jobs just to get by. 400,000 black Southerners moved to northern cities, and by 1932, 2 million African Americans were on some sort of relief, and 50% or more were unemployed as a result of the early years of the Depression. Again, pouring salt on the wound, a horrible court case, a set of incidents occur in 1931 called the Scottsboro Boys case. This was when 9 black boys who were train hopping were accused of raping 2 women. The Scottsboro Boys is what they were named. They were sentenced to death despite all evidence pointing them to be innocent. We'll watch a video on this in class. Many organizations began to fight for the boys' innocence. None of the boys were executed, but were given unfair trials. Some were remanded, they were brought up, they were tried again, but they spent so many years in jail that their lives were truly forever changed. The NAACP does begin to petition for African American rights in labor unions, led by a man named Walter White, not from Breaking Bad, but another Walter White. But remember, the NAACP, they petition for permanent change, which means getting change done in the Supreme Court. The Depression is going to take a huge hit with Hispanic or Mexican Americans. Many Mexican Americans had come to the United States working as migrant farmers, and many Mexicans are going to be sent back to Mexico because the priority was getting the white people employed, no matter what region of the country you're in, but mostly here, the South and the Southwest, or the West and the Southwest. Any relief efforts that took place in the West pretty much all but ignored Latinos. Hospitals refused to treat them, and schools refused to enroll. They wanted people to leave and stop taking jobs. Many Mexican workers were forced to cities like LA, where they were unemployed, lived in poverty, and just really created horrible situations for them. The same goes for Asian Americans during the Depression. In California, many worked at fruit stands when they had college degrees. Many Asian Americans lost their jobs to whites, both farming and industrial during the time, which is a theme between all of the minority groups in America, including women. The Japanese American Citizens League formed during this time period. This created new Japanese American democratic clubs, basically to fight for rights and equality and less discrimination for all minorities, but specifically Asian American minorities. This group encouraged people to assimilate, though, and take on American culture in order to be more accepted into American jobs and American society. Women in the workplace in the Great Depression will experience change. Definitely, there was a widespread belief that women shouldn't be working during the Depression, but this actually was kind of a failed effort. So, women were the largest group of new workers because some of these jobs just had to stay around. Some predominantly female jobs were taken by men, especially in education and social work, but women's secretarial jobs were less likely to be cut than men in industries, and many women did keep their jobs. Black women in domestic service were losing their jobs due to lack of demand. People just couldn't afford to have a servant anymore. Feminists, unfortunately, did lose a lot of ground during this time period after the Roaring 20s, where they were, so liberated and free, and during the Progressive Era, when they were given the right to vote. Women were much more suppressed during this time period. There you can see some effects of the Depression on women in the workplace. Families, too, experienced horrible despair. We start to see a huge retreat from consumerism, which is obviously a major change from the Roaring 20s. Families could no longer buy what they wanted, but they could barely afford what they even needed. Many families moved jobs back into the home. They're cooking, they're cleaning, they're sewing, their clothes, etc. And families all moved in together. So maybe a couple different groups would move into one house in order to only have to pay one rent or one mortgage. The divorce rate actually went down during the Depression because people simply couldn't afford divorce. But many men were deserting their families to avoid the humiliation of not being able to care for their families. Marriage and birth rates obviously declined because A, weddings and babies are expensive, and B, people just have other things on their minds. So this is a decade of less marriage and less birth. And you can see some really impactful pictures there. Now, this slide is important, but it's not a key concept. We have this kind of idea of American individualism. A lot of self-blame took place. Americans were ashamed of their joblessness, and they refused to leave their homes. But we are going to see people start to accept that, hey, maybe the government can help us. So we are going to start to see the idea of government assistance. People are going to start blaming their hardships on industry moguls, tycoons, and that's going to see a decline in the support for big business. But the idea of the harder you work, the more success you'll experience does kind of start to go by the wayside because people who worked extremely hard were still hit and affected by the Depression. A really important part of this time period is also art, as it exposed the harsh realities of the Depression. People used photography, and people wanted to portray what people were experiencing during this time period. They wanted to expose the problems that the Depression brought on, just like the muckrakers in the Progressive Era. Writers also begin to expose social justices from all regions around the United States, including John Steinbeck, who's the author of Mice and Men, which I'm not sure if you guys have read that yet, but that talks about migrant workers in the West, in the Southwest. Dorothea Lange is a famous photographer of the time, Walker Evans, Arthur Rothstein, all famous painters and photographers of the time period, portraying the realities of America during the 1930s. Radio is going to become an integral part of society as it becomes really one of the only senses of community. It created a form of entertainment during the Depression. It was a very inexpensive way for families to bond and for families to, not have to spend money, but also, whether it's listening to a game or a concert or a comedy series, it was like an escape for people. Radio truly brought the nation together during extremely hard times, bringing many people closer to their families and to their homes. The 1930s are going to bring us some of the most famous cartoons and movies. Movies remained affordable and appealing, and we started to add sound and color, so they became extra appealing. Some of the famous movies, we have Grapes of Wrath, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. We're going to see the creation of Snow White and Mickey Mouse, or Steamboat Willie, and the rise of Walt Disney during this time period. We do see popular literature as far as books like Gone with the Wind, and these were escapist novels. Life magazine is going to photograph the hard times of the Depression and really show people across the country what their other fellow Americans are going through. Some anti-capitalists that are going to rise from this is the American Communist Party. We will see that rise. Supporters of Joseph Stalin, they sympathized with American groups. And the Spanish Civil War, anti-fascism is going to rise. We're going to see a group called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade go over to Spain to fight against Francisco Franco, who was being supported by Mussolini and Hitler in their civil war. Many died in combat, but they did fulfill their desire to be part of something bigger than American isolationism. They believed we had to stop fascism in its tracks. The Southern Tenant Farmers Union, the STFU, yes, that is the acronym, was led by the Socialist Party. They tried to create a sort of coalition of sharecroppers, tenant farmers, and other agricultural workers that would be kind of on an even playing field. The Great Depression did allow for the first time more acceptance of the left because people were angry with capitalism. They believed it had failed. We're also going to see a more hands-on approach to governing, and we're going to see that hands-on approach being more accepted because everybody needed help. And then books like The Grapes of Wrath are going to study the Joad family and the reality of living in Oklahoma during the time. Okay, so we have to look at Herbert Hoover's response to the Great Depression, and Herbert Hoover's response was really, really lackluster, and it's what really got people to blame him, even though he was not the cause of the Great Depression. He was cause for, horrible times afterwards. He suggested that businesses should continue to produce, and he was against unions, so he believed that unions should halt demands and basically pump the brakes. He planned to increase consumer spending on works projects, but he just never planned on spending enough to bring us out of the Depression. He faltered on a couple of spending plans, he panicked, and in turn, he tried to raise taxes to avoid a deficit, which is just laughable. He does make an attempt to stimulate farmers, as they were one of the main problems of the Depression. He implemented what's called the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, raising a tariff on agricultural goods. But when he does that, people just stop buying our goods, so it ultimately hurts the farmers instead of helping them. He does try the RFC, or the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. What this does, it's basically like a New Deal program. It provides federal loans to banks, railroads, businesses, and local businesses. Federal government was giving money to public works projects, which provides jobs, but due to him not using all of the available funds, this becomes, just like an idea that never really comes to fruition because he was too nervous, to be too hands-on. A couple other issues that take place, the Farmers Holiday Association was a farmers' strike. It failed on a large scale, but did block the market for a couple of goods, which is going to hurt the economy, and many people blamed Hoover for this. The worst event that took place is what's called the Bonus Army. The Bonus Army was a group of World War I veterans that were promised a $1,000 bonus by 1945. But what they wanted was their bonus early. They demanded their bonus in 1932, and Hoover refused. So what they called themselves was the Bonus Expeditionary Forces, just like in World War I. They marched on Washington. You can see their protest there. And they set up camp and stayed for months and months. And finally, Hoover, who was uncomfortable with the situation, tried to send police, but when that didn't work, he's going to send in two military leaders. You might have heard of them: Dwight D. Eisenhower and Douglas MacArthur. Think World War II. Using machine guns and tanks, they're basically going to run over the Bonus Army and run them out of Washington. And they did this with huge tanks, and all these people wanted was some sort of relief, and they're veterans. So this looks really, really bad for Hoover, and it's going to lead to his demise. So in 1932, the Democrats are going to nominate FDR again. He focused on economics and uniting the different Democratic groups to come together under one, and Republicans nominated Hoover again. So it's Hoover versus FDR, and this is a pretty crazy electoral map here on the right. 472 to 59 electoral votes. So wow, that's really, really crazy. He pledged a New Deal. He gave no details, but people said anything. We'll take anything. We'll take anything more than what we've been given, which is close to nothing. So people were ready for change, and Roosevelt is going to be elected and serve president from 1932 until 1945. There was a horrible bank crisis, as many banks had closed, and that's the first thing that is going to be addressed. Roosevelt faced the mass closing of banks as president-elect, but he refuses Hoover's insistence to pledge no heavy borrowing and keeping a balanced budget, and FDR's like, dude, I can't, no, we have to spend. So that is it. That will lead us into the New Deal, which we will start next week. Thank you for listening.